All right. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? And like I said, there's no waiting room, so people can kind of come in as they're able to. So thank you for the folks that are on with us live. I am Dr. Pooja Lakshman. I am a psychiatrist and the author of the book Real Self-Care. And I am so delighted to be here this afternoon with my three friends and colleagues to have this conversation. Um, about caregiving and parenting and whether the words matter. Um, so just as a little primer for housekeeping, if we can have folks mute, that would be great. And we are wanting this to be a very casual, collaborative conversation. Please feel free to use the chat with each other. We would love to just have all the side conversations, all the ideas come out. This isn't, I think we said in the invitation that it's a webinar, but we are really not thinking of this as a webinar, but more just like a curated conversation and the beginning of a conversation. And hopefully there will be many more of these continued conversations, because once we dive into this, I think we, as the four of us have said, we could probably talk about this for hours and hours, but we will just be here for 1 hour today. So when you signed up for today's webinar, we asked you to describe what the word caregiver means to you. And we had more than 200 people sign up, and most folks actually did answer that question, even though it wasn't required. And I thought that that was really fascinating because the answers were so different. Answers were really different. And there were people who said, there was one person that said synonymous with life giver. Whereas another person said lack of sleep. And somebody else said sacrifice, exhaustion, mental and physical exertion. So there really was just this wide breadth of folks who leaned positive, and folks who leaned perhaps negative, and then folks who kind of leaned into like a love and a spiritual kind of place, and then folks who leaned into like a very operational, logistical place. So hopefully this conversation, our aim is to sort of like dive into all those different things, and of course focus on the words that we're using. So the last thing I will say is that I know some of the folks here are caregivers, and other folks are doing this work. And so we want, if you are somebody who's a researcher or an author, we hope that this conversation will spark different threads for you in your own work as well. So let me introduce my three friends here. So Dr. Allison Applebaum is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist who focuses on caregiver stress. Dr. Molly Dickens is a stress physiologist and the founder of the Maternal Stress Project. And Serene Noor Ali is the co-founder of Sleuth, which is a crowdsourcing platform for parents, and she's also a parent caregiver. Message in the chat. Sorry, guys. As I said, this is very casual, so apologize if there's technical. Oh no, it looks like it's saying the host is in another meeting. Yikes. So let me know how to later.
But you're getting cut off a little bit.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, you're back. You're back.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened. But maybe we just keep going.
Okay.
So that we can kind of have the conversation for the folks who are here. And then we'll send the recording too if there's a problem with the link. So sorry about that. Well, why don't we keep going? So Allison and Serene, both of you have written and have talked publicly extensively about your caregiving experiences, and they've both been quite distinct. And I thought to kick it off, it would be great to hear a little bit about both of your stories. So Allison, can you tell us a little bit more to start off?
Absolutely. So excited to be here. Caregiving has touched every aspect of my life, both personally and professionally. And I just want to start briefly with the professional piece. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And when I came to Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where I was previously on faculty, but this was back in 2010 as a postdoctoral fellow, at that time, I was so impressed by the support available for patients with cancer, both within my institution and cancer centers across the country, but realized very quickly back then that there was little to no support available for family caregivers. These are the parents and partners and children and siblings of friends of patients receiving cancer care at that time. Despite the fact that long before the pandemic, cancer care specifically, but healthcare more broadly, was really relying on families to shoulder tremendous patient care responsibilities. I was struck by the fact that back then the scientific literature already showed that the distress and burden experienced by family caregivers was profound, and that there were no, at that time, psychosocial care programs for family caregivers. So a year later in 2011, I sought to change that and founded the Caregivers Clinic at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, whose mission is to assure that no caregiver experiencing significant distress as a result of their critical role goes unidentified and deprived of necessary psychosocial care. The clinic was the first of its kind. I'm happy to say it's no longer the only of its kind. And part of my mission is to ensure that in the next 10 years, every cancer center and hospital system has a similar support program for caregivers. The same year that I founded the Caregivers Clinic, I stepped into the caregiving role for my father, Stan Applebaum. My dad had me later in life. He was nearly 60 when I came into the picture, and he lived until his late 80s with really only minor medical problems, and then had a series of hospitalizations, during one in which a medical mistake put him into a coma. There was one silver lining, and that is that coma gave his team of doctors a hint that he might have Lewy body disease, or LBD for short. LBD is a progressive neurodegenerative disease, and it leads to fluctuations in autonomic functioning and consciousness, which meant my dad would have sudden drops in blood pressure and temperature to near hypothermia levels, and he would hallucinate. He would hallucinate anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. Occasionally, he would hallucinate an entire day, and one time he hallucinated an entire week. I never knew how long the hallucinations would last, and I personally experienced each one of these as a mini death. A year after my dad's diagnosis, I'd already stepped into the caregiving role, but my mother died suddenly. She was 22 years younger than he. She was the parent I had imagined being present for the unfolding of my adulthood. And so my caregiving journey for my father was then punctuated by grief and trauma. What's so striking to me as I look back, here I am, a healthcare professional. I was on faculty at the time at one of the hospitals where my dad was receiving the majority of his healthcare. And yet I found the caregiving role so tremendously challenging to navigate our healthcare system, despite the fact that I came to it with this higher education and expertise in caregiving. And I realized that my experience is just a microcosm of the experience of the 53 million caregivers in this country. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm going to stop there, but caregiving is such an important topic for me, and us teasing apart the language is really of utmost importance.
Serene, before we get to you, I just want to jump in and say, and Allison, and one of the ways that Stand By Me, your book, is so special is that you're able to weave together the science and the personal.
Thank you for that.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Pooja, Molly, and Allison for this conversation. In our prep, we ended up just talking so much. There's so much to cover and uncover, and I think, frankly, redefine and build. And so I think this conversation is very much in the, like, what can we uncover together? And it starts in this conversation, though not in all conversations necessarily, about like how do we make distinct different experiences so that there's more visibility for people that have different experiences. And the reason we did caregiving and parenting is because often those are conflated. And what's really fun about that for this people in this conversation is that Allison and I both felt very strongly about decoupling it, even though we come from very different starting points. And so my starting point is that I am a mother of two. My younger one had some medical needs, but before she had medical needs, she had some delays. And I kept tripping up on like, what's the right wording? Is it special needs? Is it medical needs? And they all made me feel really uncomfortable because none of them, including the word caregiver, really imbue her with the sense of dignity and dynamism that she has. And so that is a tension I will hold in this conversation the whole time, which is when I talk about her, I feel deeply uncomfortable talking about her in some ways because she is telling her own story already. And so I do not publicly talk about her diagnosis. I will share it in private. And she has recently told me and asked me not to share it publicly. And so even in my own social media content, I have kind of pulled back on how much I'm willing to say, because I think ultimately what this conversation about is our experience as caregivers, and we all want to preserve the dignity of our loved ones. And I think the thing about parenting versus caregiving is that, frankly, I was like, it was very triggering for me. You know, parenting culture, particularly coastal parenting culture, is really saturated. It feels very individual. It feels very oriented towards achievement. And when you have a child with anything, any side of needs, like that is literally the opposite of achievement culture, whether you want it or not. And so there is this sense coming at me of like, you know, so there was a time when my daughter, when she was really little, she had 17 therapies. She was going on 0 play dates. She would go from school to therapies. And I remember there was this moment where I was like, you know what? This really sucks for her. And it really sucks for me because I've stopped talking to my friends and I only talk to her therapist. I have nothing left in the tank to socialize with anyone about. And even if I did socialize, the conversations that were happening around me were a little bit too much for me at that moment, right? Like when you think about, you know, a caregiver is often taking care of someone that is a loved one. It doesn't always have to be your child, but if a parent caregiver, it is your child, with someone that has something chronic and ongoing that requires care. And so one of the things it asks you to do, aside from much more intense management of, as you know, as a parent caregiver versus the parent, is like it actually asks you to stretch psychologically in ways that are very, very difficult. And so Molly's work on this is really important to me. And Allison's comment actually before we got into this was this idea of like spiritual growth. The spiritual growth I have had has come from being a parent caregiver more than it has been coming from a parent, because I have literally had to reimagine what life and family goals look like. And I think the last point I want to make before we go is like, I would love for this conversation to help open things up for anyone who's a caregiver, because my experience as a caregiver with a child that has certain things may not look at all like another caregiver of a child with things. And I think that the task at hand is really, what does it look like to make space for this spectrum of experiences while holding that there are different types of care and caring.
Well, there was just so much there that I want to follow, like every single thread that you just mentioned, Serene. The things that stand out to me are you use that word dignity, and I think that there's a way that with parenting, I think we have more of that it's baked in, whereas with caregiving, I think that that's something that it seems like you have to really reach for and defend, where it's not sort of baked in. And I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that. The other thing that struck me is that word chronic, right? That it's kind of ongoing. And so Molly, you are a stress physiologist, and when we talk about stress and chronic stress, I would love to see, your lens that you bring to this is very different, adds a whole nother layer. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think about caregiving?
Yeah, so first, thank you, Pooja, for hosting, and Serene and Allison for being here. Obviously, like I'm, in this mode of tell me all the things, and I'm absorbing and crunching, and I love that we're in conversation about this. So just really quick to bring everyone up to speed on where I'm coming in from this. My work these days is really focusing on understanding and mapping the stress related to parenting and motherhood and caregiving and generally existing as like a woman in modern society, to be honest, with the goal being that how do we frame social and societal issues as health issues and highlight solutions that are often painted as gender equity issues or economic solutions as health solutions. And I found myself really gravitating towards this. And I found myself gravitating towards using the term caregiver, like I feel like I've seen more broadly, just in a general sense, until I had conversations with Serene and Allison. I think it was maybe a year or two ago, but the theme of today's conversation had come up in subtle ways in earlier conversations that I had. And why that fired me up was in those conversations, and as you can tell from hearing their stories and where they're coming to this with their own experience, it's so clear to me that the stress related to caregiving and their caregiving experiences, it's not the same as the stress related to parenting and their view on parenting and my parenting experience. And I want to say, I don't mean to say that parenting is not stressful. Parenting is stressful, especially in modern times. I mean, the Surgeon General just released an advisory saying that parenting in modern America is stressful. But when you boil it down and think about parenting and pure parenting, and maybe this is another way to define parenting, if you think about raising a child in today's world, raising a child is stressful, but it has its own set of stressors. It has its own challenges. And the same needs to be seen for caregiving, whatever caregiving means to those providing care in a different way that's separated from parenting. And I think the distinction and the nuance will help us see where the stressors are and the solutions are, but we need to be able to separate them out. I mean, as Allison pointed out, caregiving in the research space around stress, caregiving is acknowledged as a source of chronic stress. Researchers study caregiving for medically ill family members as a human model to study the health effects of chronic stress. And we know from with parent caregivers, there is additional stress that they are reporting, that they are experiencing, additional medical health and mental health issues that they are reporting. And that's on top of parenting. And so I feel like I'm talking around this, but it seems like it's so layered. And there is a layer of caregiving stress that goes on top of the layer of parenting stress. And those layers may bend and shift depending on the age of your children, the medical needs of your children, the additional care that you are providing for aging or ill family members. It just bends and shifts across a lifespan. But again, we can't flatten it. And another thing that I come back to, and this comes from Allison and Serene's stories too, is that there's an opposite side of stress. There is stress buffers that are part of this. There is joy, there is love, there is companionship. And that is the other side of it that's kind of buffering the inevitable stress of this time of life. And parenting has a different relationship to joy and love and companionship. And caring for a medically ill family member has a different relationship to joy and love and companionship. And we have to, again, see those layers as well and see those layers as distinct, because again, when we conflate the term, we're flattening it. and it makes it harder to peel it apart. And so when you can't peel it apart, it's harder to build the solutions or to identify the risks or to talk about it or to even see how people are living in their own version of those layers. And so I would actually love to kick it to you, Pooja, because you work with your patients who are experiencing the stress of parenting, the stress of caregiving. How is it showing up for you in your work?
Yeah, it's well, first of all, thank you, Molly, for all of your great insights about the stress piece, and I love how you frame it in the layered approach, right? I think thinking of it and visualizing these concepts as layers is helpful because it reminds us of the both and that everything coexists, or can coexist. I notice with my patients, so I'm a perinatal psychiatrist, and so most of my all of my patients are women, identify as women. Most of them are pregnant or postpartum, not all of them. I noticed that my patients feel, even with their psychiatrist, even with their therapist, they feel more free to talk about mom guilt and parenting guilt than they feel free to talk about the guilt of and the stress of taking care of their own aging parents or their own um, parents that are dealing with health issues, or in-laws that are living with them that are dealing with health issues, the health issues of their children, like that, the medical piece and the when it's somebody who is moving towards the end of life, I find that, like, even with me, my patients will say, I feel so bad saying this. I feel like a bad daughter. I feel like a bad wife, because I should be able to just handle this. And to me, it's interesting. Like, I find it sort of almost paradoxical because since our culture really doesn't make space for the caregiving conversations, in so much of daily life, that caregiving piece is invisible. I just find it sort of paradoxical because many women grow up, whether this is good or bad, expecting to become mothers. Whereas you don't necessarily expect that, like Allison said, that she would ultimately have to change her own father's diaper, right? Yet we still have so much, it almost seems like there's more shame that comes up there. And actually, I'm thinking, Allison, one of the things that you talk about so much is just the difference between caregiving and end of life versus like what we kind of normally think about, which is with parenting in the beginning of life. I'd love to hear like just your more
Yeah.
on there.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, my head is spinning with so many different ideas and thoughts. Yeah, I love the ways you describe this, Molly, in terms of also the joys. I think that's important for us to also acknowledge the ways in which we as family caregivers or parents can experience or connect to joy and meaning and purpose. And those two can be very different. As a clinical psychologist, as a caregiver myself, as someone who's gone through loss and trauma, and of course, working with thousands of patients who are taking care of those with medical illnesses, I think there's such an important setting here, and that is the emotional, existential, and spiritual setting in which the care is happening. And it is a much different emotional experience to be taking care of someone. I won't say loved one. It doesn't have to be a loved one, but taking care of someone is going to die, or someone whose physical capacity is not going to improve. That is a much different experience of care than caring for, in the case of parents, a child that you wanted, that you worked so hard for in some cases to bring into the world. And yes, it's difficult, but the emotional tone is different there. And I think that piece, Molly, contributes so much to the differences in the stress response, because I knew from day one of taking care of my dad that the end was his death. I knew that was going to happen, whether it was going to happen in a year or 2 years or 5 years or in 1 week, that ultimately all of my efforts in the end, while of course they were focused on promoting quality of life, eventually they were towards promoting quality of death. And that is a very, very heavy weight that we as family caregivers carry. I gave the example earlier. I talk about it in my book, Stand By Me, but I did have the experience of changing my dad's diaper, which was a very complicated emotional experience, both for me and my dad. We thankfully had a deliciously beautiful relationship, and we could talk about how messed up that was. And he didn't want me to change it, but we had no choice, because had I not changed it, it would have become a medical emergency. Feces would have gotten to his bed sore. He would have become septic and died. I had no choice. Changing my dad's diaper was life-saving. And yet the emotional tone of that changing the diaper was so very different. At the time, I was, 35, he was 95. I don't remember, something like that. That's not the situation we had wanted. It's just a very different emotional tone. And, I was trying to think of the other sort of categories of differences emotionally and spiritually that we have in family caregiving versus parenting. Two more came to mind that I want to share right now. And one is the commonality that every family caregiver experiences. By family caregiver, of an individual living with a chronic or life-limiting illness or disability. And that is the immense uncertainty with which we live. Not being able to plan for the next year or a month or week or day, or when my dad was hallucinating the next hour, I lived that period of caregiving not being able to plan for anything. And that was maddening. That was so hard for me. It prevented me from creating my life at the same time. And while, yes, of course, with parenting, there's limitations on plans, you are able to be future oriented. Whereas in caregiving for the medically ill, you are forced to just be present oriented, and that's all you get. Mm-hmm. And while there are gifts to that, and I talk about that in my book, my mindfulness skills are spot on right now, there are a lot of losses that come with that shape the experience. And one other piece I want to talk about is isolation. Family caregivers of individuals living with chronic or life-limiting illnesses are incredibly isolated. I want to say I had an incredible support network. I had close girlfriends who were family. I had colleagues who were helping. But ultimately, I was so alone in caregiving, and I felt that deeply. I felt like so many others couldn't appreciate what I was going through. I had an ultra marathon. There was a lot of compassion fatigue among my network, because it wasn't just days or weeks, it was years for me of having hospitalizations with my dad, especially after my mom died. I felt so alone. And I also, of course, did not receive the type of support that new parents received. One of my girlfriends had her first baby recently, and I was at the shower, and it was so amazing to see the outpouring of support that she got. The year supply of diapers, for example, the clothing, the food, the money, the finances, the emotional support that was there. If I could have had my correlate of a shower when I stepped into the caregiving role, oh my gosh, what that would have been for me. I never had that. We don't get that as family caregivers. Mm-hmm. And I bring that up because the isolation piece is so big. There's so much support, parent groups here and there, but so little support for family caregivers of the medically ill. So I want to stop there, but just to say that these elements, the uncertainty, the isolation, and I think the most important, which is we are not putting our energy towards creating new life. It's not life promoting. It's about helping someone whose life might be ending. That is an emotional tone that shapes the entire experience.
And I'm just going to jump in for a second, because those three things that you highlighted, to me, I'm like, stress, because we know from stress research that one of the things that relates to how we internalize and how stress becomes damaging to our health is this concept of, is it getting worse or is it getting better? And the way that you categorized it, whether it's chronic or whether it's going towards, helping someone leave this life, it always has that element of, it's closing down. It's not opening up. Like parenting it's opening up. A diaper is not a diaper. Those diapering experiences are, one is closing in and one is opening up, right? And the other piece that you brought in, that uncertainty is a elemental trigger in our brain that triggers how we respond to challenges in our environment. That is what we in many ways classify as a stressor. And yes, there are absolutely uncertainties with parenting, 100%. but it's different from the uncertainties that you are categorizing. And I'm sure from how Serene would describe her own experience, again, distinct, just the distinction in those experiences. And then isolation. I mean, I feel like I heard this in Serene's story too, the isolation of not being able to share, not being in community, not being, it closes down. Whereas in many ways, parenting, yes, parenting can be isolating in its own way, but it's different. It's just a different form of isolation. And I think thank you for highlighting those three things. Because again, I think that is a really good way of seeing where the distinction really comes in.
I found myself thinking about that thread of uncertainty and how destabilizing uncertainty is. And Serena, I'm thinking, I want to pose this question to you. In my practice, when I have patients that have children, babies, young kids that are dealing with whether it's a developmental issue or trying to get a diagnosis, there's so much uncertainty in that context. And my patients usually, the thing that we end up talking about over and over in our therapy sessions is that they don't actually know if their kid is getting better or worse.
Right.
And that you don't know, to me, seems like it's that's part of the burden. And so I would love to hear a little bit for how your experience and how you parse those things apart and found kind of were you able to find equilibrium?
Yeah. I mean, I keep going back to what Allison was saying because there's something that flips, like things flip upside down. Like I think what I hear Allison saying is you don't expect to be doing that for your adult parent, right? Because you're the child. And I think what's similar is that when you have a child with a rare condition whose life expectancy is shortened, you don't expect your child to outlive you. Right. And so in my mind, what's swimming is what are the categories, right? Because actually there's just so much overlap. And it's almost like we would have one set of categories if we use words, right? We'd have family caregiver, parent caregiver, parenting. But if we classified by stress, it would give us other categories. And so I think uncertainty is definitely there, no matter what category you're in. And so I just wanted to bring in the families of children with rare conditions who will always need care all the time, will not have independent adulthood, and how that also feels while, yes, maybe I'm ushered in life, that life will not get the fulsome vision that I thought maybe at the beginning of the process. And I think whatever level of uncertainty you have, it's very traumatic. Like I lost my father to a chronic illness just before I found out that my younger daughter was kind of going through stuff, right? And her journey was long. And so, Pooja, I think one thing you're also saying is like that journey is long. And I want to say that the diagnosis journey, I don't know much about the adult journey, but the diagnosis journey for kids is very, very long. And so there's a lot of moments of complete breaking down, identity change, almost like I've talked to a lot of parents through Sleuth, where they at once thought they didn't realize they were in charge. And so there's a distinction with caregiving, which is as a parent, you kind of listen to the pediatrician, but once you're a caregiver, you're part of the medical needs team and you're probably driving it. And so there's those identity markers that change from the uncertainty. And I still remember having a discussion with one of the very specialized specialists we had to see for my daughter. And he told me something about her life expectancy. And I just remember that is one of the 3 moments where I literally could not believe I was living this life that I was living. And that disbelief, I don't know that I've reconciled it in the true meaning of reconciliation. I just find myself to be in a very fortunate position about her health. And so you kind of sit with all this really heavy, like I have what I kind of consider some version of survivor's guilt because I know so many stories of other caregivers and I feel like we've worked really hard. There's a lot of stuff out of our control, but we're in a good place. And so I don't know that you ever really come to a better place. You just learn to live with the both and.
Which to me, that that speaks to grief, right? That grief is ultimately, is coming to acceptance. We wanted, but as we were chatting before this, the actual conversation, the other conversations that we had said that we wanted to make sure to talk about the role of narrative and the role of course, the theme of this conversation is what are the words that we use to describe these experiences. And I think one theme that's coming out here is that we don't have enough words to describe the experiences. And yet, in order to get more support for all of these different communities and all of the distinct experiences that folks have, we need to have words. We need to be able to tell stories so that there's media coverage, so that people can write grants, right? Like all these different things. So I guess, to all of you, I don't know who wants to grab it, but like, how do you think about sort of the pros and cons of the narrative and what we gain and maybe what we lose by shifting between parenting versus caregiving? And how do you think about that?
I'll jump in really quick because I feel like when I first brought this up to other folks that are just in the sort of general caregiving space, one of the bits of feedback that I got was like whoa, don't separate them out. Having general caregiving in the narrative is really important for visibility for everyone, because everyone can be classified, anyone and everyone can be classified as a caregiver. Anyone and everyone can be classified as someone who will need a caregiver at some point in their life. And in order to highlight the big solutions that we need to address caregiving burden, generally, we need to keep it in that kind of space. And I found that really interesting. And also at the same time, I was like, well, then how does that work in practice? Because if you look at certain policies, like something like paid leave, which should be available for caregiving at any point in time, at any point in your life, for anyone who you need to take the time to care for, right? I feel like conflating parenting and caregiving, and yes, caregiving for an infant, like we can get into language, what it means to caregive for an infant versus caregive for medical needs child or a medical needs parent or other, family or friend. But when we think about paid leave as an example, by having it kind of conflating with maternity and paternity leave, are we shooting ourselves in the foot? For lack of a better phrase, sorry, but is that becoming problematic because then it invites the other narrative of, well, mom should be home. And I can think of a million reasons why maternity and paternity leave are necessary for helping support a birth parent, for recovering from birth, for spending time with an infant if you're adopting, all the reasons, right? That could relate to parenting. And should we separate that from caregiving? You can see that I'm wrestling with this myself, but I would love to know how even Allison and Serene, from how we think about this language and how it could apply on the policy side, something like paid leave, do you think it's beneficial for getting that across the finish line in terms of a federal policy, or do you think it's become problematic because of the conflation?
I'm conflicted on this. I have a lot. I mean, I have lots of different thoughts. I think that there can be many challenges that we are unforeseen challenges in conflating the two. I'm just going to do a zoom out before I go in to answer your question specifically, which is I think that when we lump parenting and caregiving together, this is coming, I'll just use myself as an example. My own experience is one of incredible invisibility. I've attended too many lectures and seminars and events that were branded as caregiving, but eventually were conversations explicitly about parenting, and not the type of parenting Serene is speaking about, but parenting for a child who has no medical or developmental concern. It's just basic parenting. And that is a very, very, very different experience. And so I think from there's an emotional perspective, the invisibility, that's a risk. we don't want that to increase among the 53+ million family caregivers of individuals with chronic or life-limiting illnesses. There's enough invisibility. And so I'm concerned about that. Also, of course, in terms of paid family leave, the needs are different in terms of what, using myself as an example, the type of time I needed away from work is obviously much different than the time one might need if they're a new parent. And therefore, I would be concerned about lumping them together. I will also say there are, overwhelmingly, though, so much more support available for new parents than for family caregivers. The leave policies that are in existence, even in those states where there's paid family leave, New York is one of them, there are very significant limitations. If you're a sibling caregiver, you're not covered. That's a problem. There are many limitations too to bereavement leave, so much so that part of what I've been advocating in my clinical practice, I know I'm going on a tangent, but I'm just going to go with it, is that I've actually been part of the reason I'm advocating for caregiver support programs is that when you have a medical record in place documenting caregiver distress, someone else, a practitioner, can then write a disability claim for a caregiver who needs time off from work to provide care or to grieve. We've had to think about these workarounds. And so I just want to acknowledge the policies are so way behind for family caregivers versus parents. And so I would be concerned that actually we're going to continue to disenfranchise and increase the invisibility of family caregivers if we lump them together. I hear you about being able to have greater data sets. Like I'm a researcher, right? Training, right? I write grants. I want money from the NIH to do this work. But if I cite a stat that is conflating parenting and caregiving, a grant reviewer is going to point that out, and I'm not going to get that grant funded. That's not going to help me.
I agree with Allison on that point. I think it's because I think in the US specifically, we have a lack of investment in care of any type. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I love Pooja's books. I remember I actually interviewed Pooja when her book came out, and I was like, this was a complete Trojan horse. Like, you kind of think you're going in to talk about like one thing, and then she comes out and she completely changes the paradigm. And I think that what we need to do is completely change the paradigm on care. We have to make it part of our kind of fundamental fabric. And I don't think it's disconnected from larger challenges we're facing in this country of loneliness, whether you're a caregiver or not, what kids are going through, and the debate about social media. We prioritize capitalism and profits over the rights we have and our ability to care for each other. Like, it's completely connected to the disintegration of community, for example. And so I think that it actually requires, I think the caregiving nomenclature is creating a completely negative sum game. Everyone is losing. I think the majority, I understand that parents, including me, I'm also a typical parent, we are so under-resourced, we have so little infrastructure that we're just trying to grab on where we can. And so when you think about the fact that parents just became okay to say in the workplace, like, it's okay now to say that you're a parent, right? And like, you get the Slack channel, it's like, congratulations, you had a baby. No, you don't get the congratulations when you have to take care of, like, here you are fulfilling your family obligation. But I think that we need to just accept that care is a broader part of our values as Americans and be able to push that forward in a way where you don't feel bad that you have to take care of yourself. It's kind of the way that Pooja talks about, or you have to take care of a kid, or you have to take care of someone else. Because if we are only at the point where we can finally say in the workplace that we are parents, you definitely can't say you're a caregiver in the workplace. Like, we are light years away from saying that. And we need to be able to just change everything about it. And there's a question about the gendered part of this. And like, that's an entirely other, I think, big conversation, and is a huge part of why we're not talking about care and it being an American value yet.
Serene, well, first of all, thank you for all those very nice words about my book. And I think the interview that we did together was one of the first that I did when Real Self-Care came out. And it's still one of my favorite conversations that I've had, because you were just such a delightful conversation partner. So thank you. No, I'm thinking too about just that this is a larger conversation about what it means to be human too. Not only just the social media and the loneliness conversation, but also the AI conversation, and how we just continue to devalue the facets of ourselves that are human, and part of being human is being imperfect, and getting sick, and death and illness and vulnerability. And you know we collectively still think of that as weakness, as opposed to uplifting it to a fact of life and the fact of who we are. I had something else that I wanted to say, and now I'm forgetting. Oh, now I remember. That folks that are listening, I don't want this to be like super doomsday, because there's plenty of doomsday out there. But the good news, I guess, is that there are lots of folks working on this. Allison being one of the foremost folks that's working on this, and I'm also thinking about like Ai-jen Poo and Alyssa Strauss, who just wrote a great book. Like, I think, and then no, depending on what happens in November, care itself is something that is coming out in national conversations more. And I think that if we keep having these nuanced conversations, yes, it's still going to take way too long for the policies to get there, but I think having the conversations in themselves is actually really powerful.
Really quick, I just to throw a quick question to Allison and Serene, what would be your preferred language? I mean, what would be your preferred term?
This is a terrible answer, which is going to be get back to me. And part of that get back to me is I know that part of what the National Alliance for Caregiving has on their agenda for the next year is actually to have some significant dialogue around the language. And I'm quite curious about the different options they're going to be playing around with. I personally, and I talk about the language of caregiving in the opening of my book, Stand By Me, A Guide to Navigating Modern Meaningful Caregiving, because of course this is an important topic, but I personally really like the language around partner and care. And now the reason I probably like that is because I truly, with my father, was able to partner with him and he partnered with me. I imagine if my mother had been my partner in care, would I feel that way about her? And I don't know if that's the case. So I just want to qualify my answer with, I think there's many caregivers who I work with and myself as well, who would say partner in care feels like it really resonates and captures the experience. I know two phrases I talk about that we need to get rid of that people still use, which is caretaker, which is inaccurate, by the way. A caretaker by definition is someone who oversees property, land, or animals. And the other one is informal caregiver. And this was a phrase that came from the dementia caregiving literature. I wrote an editorial and I highlight myself as guilty as charged. I used it in my early years of research. I just adopted. And then as I stepped in the caregiving role, I was like, WTF, there's absolutely nothing informal about the physical, emotional, spiritual, existential, financial support I'm giving my dad. So we need to get rid of that. But to get back to the answer, I'm not sure. And I think, there's colleagues of mine in the UK and in New Zealand and Australia, they use the language of carers. That's an option as well. But I think what's important actually is the fact that this is actually going to be on the agenda for the National Alliance for Caregiving around the language of caregiving. So
That's amazing. I don't know. I don't think there's ever going to be a phrase that really captures it. I focus on like, how do I want to feel? And I kind of just want my story to have space. And I want someone else's story to have space in the way that they want agency. And the way that I specifically want agency, for example, is I want to be seen as a very ambitious woman who also prioritizes her family. I don't want it to be, I often felt like, particularly as a woman, it was like, I was never really seen in my power, which I find deeply ironic because I have become so much more powerful since being a caregiver. Because I think when you go through something hard, the amount of like I can't curse, but you know what I mean? Like you just don't care. Like I have this very much come at me attitude. Sorry, Pooja.
I was gonna say, I think you can curse. I think it's fine, but
But I think that there's such a whatever the opposite of having agency is, that's what happens when you use these terms. And so I would just want whatever term to be there to be actually in the fullness of the experience. And one book I want to highlight for parents, and Allison's book I think is amazing, particularly for family caregivers. This book by Kelly Fraden, For Any Parent, is really, really affirming. And it has a playbook and a framework. And I think the fact that she went with the idea of advanced parenting is so brilliant. Like when I saw the title of it, I felt like a badass. And I was like, oh, look at me, right? It appealed to that kind of like alpha ambitious side of me. And I think that the words that we use in the frames actually really matter, particularly when we get it to the national agenda.
I think that's so beautiful. I like that.
I just want to comment, if it's okay, and this is a little moving off topic, but part of what I heard in Serene and what you're sharing is really at the heart of so much of my work clinically and my research, which is the other side of caregiving, the opportunity that caregiving gives us to connect to meaning and purpose and strength and growth. And while we don't choose to step into the family caregiving role per se, I feel like probably neither of us felt like we had a choice in the matter with your daughter and my dad. Inevitably we emerge as different versions of ourselves. I mean, I joke I'm Allison 6.0 right now. I'm a completely different version of Allison who began taking care of her dad. And, you know, I've lost track of the number of caregivers I work with who've said to me, Dr. Applebaum, I had no idea I was so strong. Or I found my voice through caregiving because I've had to learn I used to be shy, but I've had to learn to speak up with all these healthcare professionals. And now I'm a badass. Now I can do this. And so, you know, I do want to acknowledge that piece. And I want to be very clear when I say this, that I'm not talking about turning lemons to lemonade. This is not power positive thinking stuff. This is me saying that the suffering that family caregivers experience is so real. And at the same time, it can coexist with meaning and purpose and growth. And the better supported we are, the more policies we have in place, the more included we feel, the less invisible we feel, while our ability to connect to meaning is even greater.
it was so beautifully said, Allison, and I feel like it ties right into how I wanted to sort of land the plane here, and give all of you sort of an opportunity to give a piece of advice, perhaps for folks that are on the call that are caregivers, and that are looking for a little bit of relief or solace or meaning. Molly, why don't we start with you and then go to Serene, and then Allison, you can close us out.
Oof. Well, I mean, I don't know if I have the advice here. I feel like that's more for Allison and Serene because I'm just absorbing. But I think there is something interesting to think through in terms of everyone else's role in this with the narrative and how to be just very thoughtful with how we use the words and how we relate to experiences or recognize that we cannot relate to a certain experience, and just be respectful of how we can see those layers and how we can see each other as you pointed out, as humans.
Sorry, Pooja, I missed the question because I was actually responding to the chat. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Well, it was really just a prompt for you to give some parting words and maybe advice. And actually, I was just looking at that question too. So maybe I'll just read it and maybe you can speak to that.
Sure.
As a single woman in a caregiving role for my father, society, I feel like, also devalues the agency of a single person and takes advantage of their flexibility because I don't have a partner or a child. It's, of course, I want to be there, but how do I also keep my identity and try to live my life?
So I've seen this firsthand with a few very close friends of mine, and the cultural things coming from the community that she's from are really annoying. It's like a lot of people, older people, will be like, well, of course you're going to do this, and of course you're going to do this. And I saw the struggle of writing your own story. And I think that's actually the universal challenge with caregiving, which is like, how do I get to write my own story if, you know, if you're a single person taking care of, you know, an elderly person and those expectations, in my case, you heard what it is. And it's like, I feel like in my mind, I kept wanting, I would make this motion, like, leave me alone. Like, I'm going to write my own story. And one thing that I've found very useful to writing my own story is like, I will post on LinkedIn about my story in a way that cuts the voices in my head, where it's like, oh, you like, how can you work and be a caregiver? Or like, you know, you're so cute, like you're working on pediatric health, like all this stuff. And for me, that's been actually, it's very tactical, I know, but it's been very useful for me because now people respond to my story the way that I say my story. And that's all I kind of ever wanted in the process, which was to say it the way that I wanted to. So I don't know if that helps. And I think that's probably the same closing words, which is like, I think we all want the story, even in this kind of tension between parenting and caregiving. Parents of typical children also want their story heard, and that's really valid and it's really important. And we have to figure out how to make this space for people to come as they are without having to kind of fall into labels as the best option. No, the best option is that everyone gets the care and the support they need.
I'll just add in like the 30 seconds that we have left, and to address the question that was in the chat, which really deeply resonates with me because I was in a similar situation. One of the most powerful things I think every family caregiver can do is answer the following question from the perspective of before they became a caregiver. And that question is, who am I? Your answer is going to have to do with your personality, the things that bring you joy, activities you like to do, your career, anything in your life. And I say that because so often as family caregivers, we become disconnected from who we are. We feel like we can no longer be our authentic selves because we are, you know, night and day caregiving. But caregiving doesn't take away our capacity to be a certain person, to enjoy a certain activity. It might lead to some creativity. And I would encourage you to answer the question, who am I? And then think creatively about how you can remain connected to that part of yourself while caregiving. It's going to look different. You can't necessarily continue to go to the gym every day if you're someone who's super athletic, or a patient of mine who loved to garden, couldn't, you know, do big gardening, but she could make little window boxes or houseplants. Or for me, it was realizing the bars on my dad's hospital bed were ballet bars for me. I couldn't go to take a dance class, but I could spend 10 minutes doing a little ballet by his hospital bedside. And doing that reconnected with me, with my authentic sense of self, my strength, my dignity, and just a really good feeling of I'm still here despite caregiving. So I would encourage you to answer that question for yourself during your journey as it unfolds with your dad. And for everyone else in the room as well.
Well, thank you, all of you who hopped on and spent an hour with us today. This conversation was just very soul nourishing for me, and I hope for everyone that was on as well. It was recorded, and so you will get this recording in your email. It'll probably be a day or two because we have to like cut it and things like that, but you will get it. And yeah, thank you for being on with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if the three of you are available, once everyone signs off, we can just do a little.
Bye, everyone else.